And Brian, I just want to give a little bio on you before I bring you on. I think it's important for today. Brian Godawa has been a professional filmmaker, writer and visual artist for many years. Creative versatility born out of a passion for both intellect and imagination, left brain and right brain. The result is that Brian is an artisan of word, image and story that engages heart, mind and soul. Just think the Renaissance man. He has been a screenwriter for the award-winning feature film To End All Wars, which starred Kiefer Sutherland and alleged starring Brian Dennehy as Clarence Darrow, along with Fred Thompson as William Jennings Bryan. Previously, Brian adapted to film the best-selling supernatural thriller novel The Visitation by author Frank Peretti for Ralph Winter X-Men and Planet of the Apes. And if that wasn't enough, Brian is the author of the Chronicles of the Nephilim series of books, which is actually what we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, let's bring on our super exciting guest. Hi, Brian. You're very welcome to the show.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks for having me. Great
to have you, Brian. Brian, I had to do that. I know there's a lot to get through there on the bio. It's just a super interesting background you have. I guess to mention for the audience that the Chronicles of the Nephilim series is what we would call biblical fiction. It's an unusual genre, Brian. Before I get into that and why you have gone down the biblical fiction route, tell us about the screenwriting background. It's obviously incredibly interesting. I mean, you've got some heavy-hitting rapport there with some big names. Tell us a little bit about the screenplay writing element of your career first.
Yeah, well, I started years ago started out as solely a screenwriter, and that's all I wanted to really be in life. And I love movies. Anyway, my first movie that got made was To End All Wars, which starred Kiefer Sutherland and Robert Carlyle, and that came out around 2001 or 2002. And I got a lot of awards and a lot of critical acclaim. And that was a true story of prisoners of war, Allied prisoners of war under the Japanese during World War II. And it was kind of like if you saw the movie Bridge on the River Kwai, this was the true story that you didn't see. It was the non-Hollywood version of the suffering that our servicemen really had to undergo during that time period. And it was a very, very powerful, moving spiritual story as well. And that kind of launched my film work, you know. And since then I've been working as an independent filmmaker, which means I'm not like in the big studio system working on the big movies. Sure. I make the smaller movies, the lower budget movies, but the great thing that's been for me is I've been able to work on projects that I really believe in, that have a really, you know, meaningful message, whether it's a documentary on church and state separation or stem cell research, or even the horror film I wrote, The Visitation, which is sort of like about demon possession, all that kind of stuff. I've been able to work on stuff that's more meaningful and have more of an impact, because the higher you go up in the food chain in Hollywood, you know, the more you get involved in the bigger stuff, the less control you really have, and particularly as a writer. So I've kind of stayed in the independent realm for whatever reason. That's where I've been, and I'm grateful to have been there. But you know, about five years ago or so, the whole industry was hit pretty hard, and it was really hard going for a couple of years of getting work. And it sort of forced me to reevaluate myself and reinvent myself. And I started thinking, well, what else can I do? Because not just screenwriting. And I'd always thought, you know, someday in the future, I'll write novels when I don't make movies anymore. And for a year or so, I wasn't making any movies. And I thought, well, why don't I write a novel, you know? But in that time period, excuse me, this is actually a transition, because in that time period, excuse me, I came up with this brilliant idea. I thought, okay, I got a great idea. I'm a religious believer. I believe in the Bible and that kind of stuff. And I love spiritual meaning and purpose and all that. So I thought, you know, there was a story that, you know, in recent years, people have been making some movies, you know, from the Bible, or let's put it this way, certainly spiritually interested themes, whether it's, Greek gods, you know, like, what was that series, the young adult series with Percy Jackson and Clash of the Titans. You know, there's a real big religious interest in Hollywood movies, you know. But I thought, well, I'll do something really unique that someone's never done before, because I started doing research on the story of Noah. And I discovered these amazing, bizarre things that I kind of knew were there, but I always avoided them. And of course, I, as you already know, I soon discovered after I wrote my script, I was out trying to get it interested in Hollywood, and it was a big budget movie, and you really have to have good connections to get those things sold. So I wasn't doing that well. But then I found out Darren Aronofsky was making his Noah movie. And I thought, oh, man, yeah, he's going to beat me to it. I know that because obviously he has much more weight in Hollywood and all that. So I thought, well, how could I beat him? Because just in case we have ideas that are similar, how could I beat him to the punch? And that's where I realized, well, I'll adapt the novel. I'll adapt the screenplay to the novel, which is what I wanted to eventually do. And that sort of is the turning point. That was like 4.5 years ago. That launched me off into this novel writing series now that has actually become an income for me, that's a whole nother show we could talk about. But it transmogrified into Chronicles of the Nephilim, because when I did the research on Noah, the thing that originally interested me was this Genesis 6:1-4, which is the passage that talks about how these angelic sons of God came down and mated with daughters of men, and they bore them Nephilim, or giants, and these were men of great renown, this kind of stuff. And that was so weird. But when I looked into it, I used to think that was just one obscure passage of several obscure passages in the Bible. But I did research on it and found out, no, they're connected with a storyline that goes throughout the Bible that I'd never seen before. And it was truly fascinating. And I entered into this realm of discovering that there's a lot of people who are already into this stuff. And we're talking both religious people as well as atheists, and non-believers and all that, Nephilim, Anunnaki, and all that kind of stuff. And so in the last 4 years, I've been writing that series, and it's up to 8 books now, Chronicles of the Nephilim.
Sure. Do you think... maybe you could categorize why you think there's a massive wave of cultural, maybe why there's a wave of cultural interest in Nephilim, Watchers, Giants. I mean, can you tap into why you think that massive influx of ideas is now being revered in the public domain?
That's a good question. And I don't know how well I can speak for the public at large, because like I said, in some ways, I discovered that this, sort of community was already existing. And I entered into it more from like a Christian perspective. And so for me, what in that religious side of the picture, I think what's been happening is in the last 50 years, with much more archaeological discoveries in Ugarit and in Iraq and all that before the wars, of course, but they've discovered a lot of ancient texts that have opened up our understanding of the Bible from an ancient Near Eastern perspective that I don't think we've really... Scholars have been aware of it, but this has opened the doorway. And now, so I think there's a lot of religious believers who are now open to saying, hey, maybe we've been misunderstanding in the way we read the Bible, in the sense that we come at it from our Western, scientific, modernist sort of perspective. And we need to understand it from the ancient mindset and how they saw it. And that's a lot different in many ways. And I believe that's what's been flowing over the religious community, is that let's understand the biblical text through the eyes of the ancient world instead of our own, which amounts to cultural imperialism, right? I mean, if we don't take into account what they meant and how they interpreted it, then we're just imposing our own views upon it. So that at least in the religious community is where I see has been a lot of influence. And it's just exploding. And we're talking, I don't think there's any particular kind of religious person. I've met conservatives, liberals, all different stripes and persuasions. And like I said as well, and I've seen this connection with the atheistic community or what have you, of the ancient aliens. Obviously there's a difference in interpretation there, but there's definitely a crossover and an acknowledgement that this is something that's out there, and it's not just an oddity, but it's widespread around the earth. So we've got to deal with this. I'm glad that's kind of,
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I was just wanted to pass comment on that, and you've just did it for me, and then I'll bring Susan in. But the ancient alien hypothesis have grabbed this Nephilim concept, and then you have the religious doctrines really absorbing the material, and it's like for once there's a meeting ground now, and and both people are on the same hymn sheet, as they say, and it's like it's the same material. And I see a lot of shows out there, a lot of people interpreting the data in different ways, but inevitably, I think both people, whether they're either atheist or religious or not, they're all looking at the same material for once in their life. That, you know, you have people from alternative, if you will, perspectives all meeting in the one place now. And it's, in one respect, that's good to see people unified.
Absolutely. You know what I think it marks is, I think it marks a, I wouldn't say triumph, but certainly a growth beyond the modernity or the modernism that has, in my perspective, strangled the modern man. It's this scientism. It's this worship of empiricism, only that which we can measure. Science is God. Science is, you know, the high priests are scientists, you know, that kind of a thing. And look, of course, we all accept science as being a legitimate form of knowledge, but it's not the absolute knowledge. And there's a lot of stuff that we don't understand and we can't scientifically figure out necessarily. And the ancients have a lot of stuff, a lot of, whether it's mythology or legend or a mixture of history and all of it, which is what I think it is, there's a growing recognition and appreciation of that side of the imagination of humanity that has been, I thought, suppressed for years because of the scientism, you know? And so, like you said, of course, what comes out of that is manifold interpretations, no doubt. But yeah, I agree. I think it's a good thing, and it's exciting, actually.
Susan, you want to jump in there?
I do. You know, Brian, I started doing research on you a little while ago, and I have to admit, you know, because I come from things from a little bit of a different perspective, you know, from a scientific, didn't grow up so much with the Bible. Family was Catholic, but still it was not something that I gravitated towards. So, you know, that's my own stuff, right? And so when I was starting to get into researching and understanding what you were doing, you know, I had a little bit of an adverse reaction, like, oh no, it's the Bible stuff. You know, and the more I started to listen to you, and the more I started to read, and the more I started to understand, I started to see the work that you're doing as quite a bridge, that you're able to actually look at the information that's in the Bible. And as you so beautifully put, you know, there's stories, and, you know, there's the aspect of the violence and aspect of the crime, and, you know, a man having come into this world maybe not so pure and needing to purify. So, you know, there's a lot that you say. And as I'm sitting here, you know, researching and understanding certain things, it's like you're able to create a bridge with this that I don't think anybody else is really doing out there. So, you know, one would be a comment, and I can't actually wait to start getting into more of your books. And one of the questions that I would have is, you know, like someone like myself, or maybe even, you know, a lot of other viewers that don't have, or maybe have an aversion towards, it's not an aversion towards the Bible, it's just so much of what has been attached to it, right? Through self-professed gurus and leaders and gods and prophets and what have you, that have taken humanity maybe down roads that people didn't really want to go to. Two questions. What order do you suggest people would read these in? You know, maybe for somebody who's not so experienced with it, is there a certain book that you'd recommend that they read, or a certain order of the readings?
Yeah, you know, technically the book series individual books could be read independently, but I wouldn't advise it. And I would say start with book 1 or 2. And the reason why I said it is this. The first book I wrote was Noah Primeval. And I entered into the series through that because I thought Noah is the kind of, you know, the first book of a series, you want it to be exciting, something that draws people. And the second book was Enoch Primordial. So the first book is Noah Primeval. The second one is Enoch Primordial. But I thought many people would not know about Enoch as much. So I started with Noah. Then the second book, Enoch Primordial, is actually like a prequel. So you could technically start with Noah and then read Enoch, which is number 2. And that's like, but it's like reading a prequel, which has its own advantages. Like if you watch the X-Men Origins, that kind of a thing. On the other hand, if you really want to just start with the chronological beginning, you can start with Enoch Primordial, which is, and I wrote it on the novel, it says the prequel, so you know that. But I would recommend following them in order because, and if you don't end up liking them, you don't have to continue on, but because they're, I'm telling you that the storyline, even though each of the books, jumps about 400 years, from Noah to Gilgamesh. The Gilgamesh Immortal is the 3rd book, and that happens after the flood, several hundred years. And of course, Noah happens before the flood. Then after Gilgamesh, there's the book Abraham Allegiant, which is about Abraham, the founder of, the Israel faith. And that's like another 400-year jump, but they are really connected. And one of the reasons why is because I deal with a lot of the supernatural spiritual elements. So in a way, I call these biblical fantasy, which, you're right, James, that is actually a unique sort of form because most traditional religious people would really be scared away from this notion of, wait a minute, the Bible, fantasy, aren't you playing with the word of God? That kind of a thing. But if you understand that I'm using fantasy as an element to show spiritual realities that we can't see, then it starts to make a little bit more sense. Like, for instance, one of my monsters that occurs throughout the whole series is called Leviathan. And if you read ancient texts, you're going to be familiar with that. Leviathan shows up in Canaanite literature. He shows up in Babylonian literature as Tiamat, the sea dragon. Mm-hmm. Basically, Leviathan in the Bible is a symbol for the sea dragon of chaos. And it basically represents this notion that in all religions of the ancient world, whenever you want to describe that your God is the God who made everything and superior to the other gods, you would say that, our God Baal, or what have you, or in my case, in the Bible, Yahweh crushed the heads of Leviathan, the sea dragon, to establish his covenantal order. So the notion was that in the ancient world, they saw the sea as being chaos. It was something they couldn't control, but the land was something they could. So when they and the sea also represented the bad things. And so when they wanted to describe this notion of, we're establishing our national superiority and our God, our national God is the God over all the other ones, that's what they would use, see? So in the Bible, that's used as well, but it's not intended to be literal. It is metaphorical. However, what I did in the series was I made it literal, so I have a sea dragon that is chaotic and creates chaos and all that kind of stuff. So I think that, fantasy lovers love it. People who want to sort of read something consistent with the Bible will love it because I actually try to make it as consistent with the Bible as possible, but I do bring in a lot of interpretations of things that probably more conservative religious believers would not like. However, they've been loving it too. And then lastly, I integrate it with a lot of ancient mythology, like ancient Sumer, ancient Babylon. I integrate their mythology with the storyline too. Why? Because, like we're talking about in terms of this big picture, there's something connecting. It's not coincidence that all religions and all worlds and nations over the face of the earth in the ancient world had a lot of similar concepts. There's got to be a reason for that. Look, I'm not going to deny it. I definitely come from a Christian perspective in my viewpoint. I'm not going to pull punches in that. But my goal is to try to sort of make sense of all of it in a way that best that I can, in a very entertaining way. And it's very action oriented. Chronicles of the Nephilim, each of the heroes are warrior heroes. And I even have female warrior heroes as well. And I do have some romances in there that I'm particularly proud of for the women. But the point is that I wanted to make the Bible come alive in a way that people may not have thought of before. So I'm taking these angles that they haven't thought of, but actually are consistent with the text. So you've got things like Noah as a warrior. Most people think of him as this old man with animals, right? Most people think of Abraham as an old man with sheep. But actually, if you look in the Bible, there's a passage that talks about how Abraham was a warrior. So I bring these things out in unique and fresh ways. And like I said, I love ancient mythology, even the stuff that I don't believe in, but I draw from it, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. I love that epic. And so I decided to integrate it into my storyline. And people will say, wait a minute, Epic of Gilgamesh, my third book in the series is called Gilgamesh Immortal. And people go, wait a minute, that's not a biblical hero. No, it isn't, but it's the most ancient hero story that we have. And if you read it, it's like reading a modern day movie. I'm telling you, it's really that fantastic writing. And I always wanted to retell that story and be as true as I could to the original, but tell it in a more, modern approach to storytelling. But it actually does integrate with certain theories that there are out there with the Bible. For example, at the end of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh goes in search of an ancient figure named Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim is supposedly the man who was Noah. He was the man who survived this ancient flood that they heard about, and he supposedly has eternal life. So Gilgamesh says, I want to have eternal life, so I'm going to find this Noah, or Utnapishtim. And most scholars will say they're the same character, because within different nations and different time periods, names of the same historical characters will be given, will change depending on the culture, right? So, I bring that into the text, and there's a lot more to it than that. But my point was, I've had people who love just, the ancient Gilgamesh epic, love the story. But then people who like the Bible say, wow, I never saw how that could fit in. That's really cool. So that's kind of been my goal all along.
I really like the way you do go into Sumerian history / mythology. I know there's a lot of, anything in the region of Israel, Canaanites, Sumerian. There's a Sumerian crossover in the history there too anyway. And I like the way you go into that. Yeah, exactly. And I actually have an original translation by George Smith, I think his name is it? From the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a 130-year-old book I have. It's in the room there. But when you read the first translation, it's just a modern hero story. It's you could just print it word for word, and it's like something the best creative writer could come up with. It's like it's got all the elements of a hero story. In a way, you do follow, maybe make a comparison to historical fiction, because I have had authors on the show before, but historical fiction, and in a way, whether it's biblical scripture or history, you kind of follow the scriptures, but you fill the gaps in. Is that correct? Yeah,
that's basically it. And I'll admit, I find this is something about me. I've always found the weird, bizarre things of the Bible to be immensely curious. And I want to find out, why are they in there? And I want to find out, is that a problem or not? And so through this storyline, I've actually been able to connect a lot of those things that at first had always seemed bizarre or weird, and they all make sense within this context of this paradigm, which by the way, I have to give credit where credit is due, because I think probably the most influential scholar that opened this whole door to me was Michael Heiser, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with.
Yeah, I know Michael, yeah.
Yeah, he's a scholar, and his new book just came out called Unseen Realm. And when he was writing that heavily influenced my understanding and opening the doorway for me to be able to make these connections. And so yeah, I want to give credit where credit is due on that.
He's not a fan of Zecharia Sitchin, is he?
No, he's not.
or people that are, I'd say, contemporary people in the ancient aliens world as well.
Yeah.
But starting to understand him a little bit more, you start to understand what his line of reasoning is.
Sure, and again, I'm not gonna pull any punches here. I integrate a lot of things like Anunnaki and stuff, but I do give it a different interpretation than the ancient alien crowd does. So yeah.
Let's talk a little bit on some of the weird stuff. Let's focus on Gilgamesh. I mean, Gilgamesh was somehow, a demigod with a twin brother who was a hairy giant, almost something like a Bigfoot. It's bizarre stuff, like.
Yeah, he's 2/3 human, 1/3 divine was the famous phrasing, which is interesting because in the ancient Babylonian world from which his epic comes, there was a phrase for their wise sages. They were called Apkallus, and Apkallus were believed to be from the gods, and so therefore he was from that line of ancient Apkallu wise sages and stuff, So it's kind of, there's connections with everything, but he was also considered to be a giant, which in context with the biblical notion, the biblical notion is that, you know, the word Nephilim comes from the book of Genesis, and it's actually a Hebrew transliteration. Nephilim is probably more accurate to say it, but anyway, that's a word that means giants. And that's kind of where a lot of this stuff is fueled from. But there's this notion that after the flood, with the Tower of Babel and Nimrod, this infamous evil character of history of ancient primeval history in Genesis, all this stuff in the book of Genesis 1 to 11, there's a lot of connections with Babylonian literature and understanding. So I think the Bible writers are interacting with that material. And so Gilgamesh, this is why I think Gilgamesh might be connected somehow to that text in that way. But in terms of Babylon, he was most scholars believe he was an actual historical figure who became romanticized and, you know, I don't know what the word would be, but not deified, you know, but elevated and made into a lot of legends and such. So, because there are Sumerian king lists whose name Gilgamesh is on. So yeah, it's quite fascinating. So in a way, Gilgamesh is that mixture of fantasy and history as well, which is how I think a lot of the ancient writers wrote. Now, pulling that stuff apart and trying to figure it out is a difficult thing, but that's why I kind of took that tack as well.
I'm not the greatest expert on biblical scriptures, but I seem to think that the Nephilim and the Og and the giants were just interchangeable words for the same beings, creatures, or figures.
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding with that. And let me try and, you know, do a quick scenario of what I think it is Nephilim is the original Genesis-oriented origin of the giants. But in the Bible, as time goes on, and by the way, I have this in all of my novels, as time goes on, there are different giant clans that get mentioned. So for example, in the book of Genesis, when Abraham comes on board, and this will be in my book, Abraham Allegiant, there's a war. There's these Mesopotamian kings come down into the land of Canaan, and they wipe out a bunch of clans before they capture Abraham's nephew, Lot. And then Abraham goes and rescues his nephew. Well, the names of those clans, most of them are giant clans, and you wouldn't know it until you read later in the Bible. When you read more definition, like in the book of Numbers, when the Israelites are coming into the promised land, okay, so they give these different names of clans. Some of them are the Rephaim, and that's what Og of Bashan was. Og was a Rephaim. You've got the Anakim, and the Anakim were the dominant clan during the time of Joshua. It was the Anakim, as well as the Emim and the Zuzim and several other clans. But the big ones are the Anakim during the days of Joshua and the Rephaim. And the Rephaim, you know how sometimes original words will become a generic name, like the Kleenex was originally a product and it became generic. Well, I believe that Rephaim,
the Hoover as well.
Yeah, the Hoover, right?
Vacuum cleaner.
In the Bible, Rephaim started out as a specific clan, and the Bible says that they came from the Nephilim. So, in other words, it's saying that the original Nephilim before the flood are somehow genetically linked to these other giants during the time of Joshua and all this. But here's the key. By the time of David, the word Rephaim sort of becomes the generic term for the giants that are left in the land, because when Joshua went through the land, and I write about this I have this story as well. This is my novel, Joshua Valiant. And in the Bible, it says Joshua literally hunts down all the tribes of the Anakim to get rid of them. So it's not, and there's a specific reason why, and we can go into that, but he leaves some of them in the land of Philistia. What's that about? Why would he leave some alive? Well, in the days of King David, and David became the Messiah figure, for the Jews, he was the one that finally wiped out the last of the giants, of which, by the way, Goliath was only one. The Bible tells 5 different other giants in addition to Goliath who were hunting King David. And I'm not kidding you. They're in the Bible. Again, these are things that you tend to read over because they're just sort of briefly mentioned. So in my book, David Ascendant, what I did was it names 3 out of the 5 giants. And it says that they were trying to kill King David. And I'm like, well, why is that? I think it's connected to this whole theme of the giants and which is what I'll call the seed of the war of the seed of the serpent versus the seed of Eve. And anyway, so David is sort of the last guy to wipe them out. And it's all connected to this theme in the Bible that goes way back to Genesis. Even before Genesis 6, you read in Genesis 3, verse 15, when God is cursing the serpent in the garden, he says this, he says, I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. He's saying the seed of the serpent and the seed of Eve, which basically enmity means war. And he says, he will crush your head and you will crush his heel. And what he's saying there is the seed of Eve, or Messiah, scholars say that this is the first messianic promise, Messiah seed will crush your head and you will bite at his heel. So my Chronicles of the Nephilim then chronicles throughout the biblical story that this war of the seed. And the first sort of big war that comes is before the flood, and that's with the Nephilim. And it says that the sons of God, who are the sons of God? This is where the notion of the Anunnaki and that comes up with the ancient aliens. But I think that they sometimes confuse them all as one, like, sons of God, the Nephilim, they're all the same thing, but they're really not in the Bible, because in the Bible, it talks about sons of God as being heavenly angelic beings from God's divine counsel. And they come to earth and they mate with humans. And then the result of that mating is a half angelic human hybrid, which I know this is bizarre, but anyway, and they're half angelic, half human.
We handle bizarre.
We
handle bizarre. We're good with it.
Let me switch gears a minute, Brian. Okay.
Oh, okay. Perhaps I'm rambling. Sorry.
No, not at all. Not at all, because I'm going to keep going on the Enoch book. The book of Enoch, let's mention this because the book of Enoch is a major source for the Nephilim and the Watchers. This is weird and wonderful stuff. I can probably see why it was left out of the canon. I can see why it's like, we can't put that out in public domain. It's like, push that one under the carpet. It's just too weird. I mean, it is like science fiction, what we would call science fiction today. Tell us about who Enoch was, what's so controversial about the Book of Enoch, and give me some of the details of why it's so weird and wonderful.
Yeah. And, there's been a rise of interest in the Book of Enoch on all counts, including the Christian realm as well. In recent years, a renewed respect for it. Because you're right. It had been out of circulation for, I don't know, like 70 years or so. And I think that's for different prejudices and biases. But anyway, throughout the history of the Christian church, I can tell you, though, that while Christians and even Jews did not consider it part of the canon, they did accord it high respect and high regard, and they used it as a reference point. It's only in modern days that you see this picture of, basically, I hate to say it, but Christians and who say, well, only what the Bible says is true and everything else is false. And I just don't think I think that that's just dishonest and it's just not truthful. I still do believe the Bible, I believe the Bible is God's special word and all that, but there's still truth in all these other documents. And the Christian church traditionally has had that respect for the book, but it fell out of favor for a while. And what's interesting about it is that, and it happened around the time of Augustine, but anyway, the Book of Enoch, which was probably written around, like 150 or 200 BC. Why it's so important and why there's such a renewed interest is because that verse I told you about that's become more popular today, Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Well, that whole thing about the sons of God mating with the daughters of men and having giants, that's all you read in the Genesis account until you get, way later in the text. But the Book of Enoch is like an extrapolation of that particular moment in history before the flood. Mm-hmm. And it goes into much more detail about the giants and about the sons of God. And they're called, another term they're called is watchers. And watchers is also a biblical term because it shows up in the book of Daniel. And there's something really cool about this that I want to explain, but The Watchers, so in the book of Enoch, he talks in more detail about the giants and how they grew in the land, and then how they defiled the land and they became violent, and how they influenced mankind. And it also talks about how these sons of God, not only did they mate with the daughters of men, but they revealed evil things like occultism and magic and war. They taught them war, this kind of stuff. So this picture is that, yes, man is evil, but man sort of was introduced to it through these fallen watcher beings, see? And so the book of Enoch does an expansion of that Genesis text. And that's why, of course, it's interesting to a lot of us because, could this be more details about what happened or what have you, Sure. But yeah, and so in my book, Enoch Primordial, I try to draw from the book of Enoch and integrate it with the biblical text, and as well as integrate with some other scholarly research. For example, David Roll, who's one of my favorite archaeologists.
I know David very well. I met him in Germany last week. I'm going to go see him in Spain for his new book coming out. Oh,
fantastic! What's the new book called?
I actually don't know.
What's it about?
It's about the Exodus. I think it's about the Exodus.
Got it.
Yeah.
So anyway, he brought up this point that there's an ancient Sumerian text, and I looked it up, and it's there, and the ancient Sumerian text has this link with the Bible, and it says that the seventh Apkallu, remember how I mentioned Apkallu, the seventh ancient Apkallu before the flood the seventh king was Enmi-Duranki, and it says his Apkallu sage was Utu-Abzu. But then it says this, and Utu-Abzu ascended into heaven, and then it just goes on. Well, it turns out in the Bible, the seventh wise sage from Adam, which links up with their seven, was Enoch, and the Bible says that Enoch ascended into heaven. So Roll makes this argument that Enoch may have been either Enmi-Duranki or this ancient Sumerian Apkallu named Utu-Abzu. So I take that and I make that come alive, and I tell that story, and I integrate all the Sumerian mythology. And one of the things that I love ancient mythology, but here's what I did. So remember how I explained how these watchers come from heaven and all this, and in the Bible they're perceived as evil. Again, I know there's different interpretations, but the biblical perception is that they're evil beings. And So I said to myself, okay, in the ancient world, biblical religion is monotheistic, right? And it tends to scorn the ancient polytheistic religions. Well, if you look at all the other religions, like Sumer, they had pantheons of gods. So like each city had their own patron deity, whether it's, Anu or Ea or Inanna, whatever. And they all had different, powers and stuff like that, right? So they had these pantheon of gods. But you look at ancient inscriptions and they really believed in these things, and to what degree, I'm not sure, but there's a reality to them that I think goes beyond just mere myth. What is that reality? I'm not sure, but here's the biblical perspective is that, so I said, well, what if, this is my imagination, what if these watchers who came from heaven and they wanted to defy the God Yahweh. And so what if they masqueraded as these gods of the ancient world? So they really were supernatural beings with powers and such, but they were more these angelic beings masquerading, right, as deities. And I said, what if that was the case? So then in my novels, I actually have the gods of the ancient world as real beings. And so they're going around trying to do their plans and their stuff as well. And they're sort of fighting the seed of Eve, or like Enoch, Noah, all those guys. They're trying to over all of time they're fighting against them, and that's again some of the fantasy element I bring in, but it's all based on research, and it all sort of has meaning together.
Susan, you got to jump in at this point. So I just want to make
sure.
I'm yakking.
Thanks.
I'm yakking. Susan, please.
No. It's good. It's good because I'm going to make a tie here in a minute, just a little bit, with your writing and what I'll call like the potency in the animation of how everything is jumping out. It comes to life basically, and how you're explaining it, and just some of the things that I've read as well. And one of the things that I've seen written you say, I love horror because horror is the strongest biblical genre for a postmodern world that denies moral absolutes. And then just to make a tie, something that I saw, and if you can comment a little bit more on it, and then, maybe we can tie it into just the things that are happening and going on in the world right now. And you talked about that maybe demons are dead spirits of the Nephilim.
Wow.
So
that's a very good point. Okay, this is another very interesting thing. Okay, in the Bible, now this is really fascinating. In the Bible, we have evil spirits / demons. Same thing, basically. But what's interesting is, in the Old Testament, there's almost nothing about evil spirits. There's maybe one, Saul is taunted by an evil spirit. Now, there are a couple verses where, again, I got my ideas from. For instance, Moses says, the gods of Canaan, the false gods from his perspective. And he says, they sacrifice to the gods, but those gods are demons. So in a sense, the Bible sort of hints at this spiritual reality. But the point I want to make is there's no demon possession in the Old Testament. There really isn't. Now, there is in other ancient literature, but not in the Old Testament. And I've always wondered why all of a sudden you get to the New Testament and the Gospels, and Jesus is going around and he's like casting out demons left and right, and there's one called Legion where there's maybe thousands of demons, and you're like, what's up with that? What's the point, And I think I have a better understanding now because, here's the other thing too. The Bible doesn't say where the demons come from. They're just there, evil spirits. Now, here's the thing. A lot of Christians will misunderstand. They have a misunderstanding because you say, what's a demon? It's a fallen angel, right? Like Lucifer, right? No. Biblically, if you study the nature of angels, the word malachim in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, they're not purely spiritual beings. They actually have some kind of heavenly flesh. What that's like, I don't know. They can obviously they can go between different dimensions and all that. But my point is they're described as eating food with Abraham. They're described as having sex with humans in Genesis 6. And so my point here is that they're not purely spiritual. They have some kind of body that can interact with humans, right? So they're not demons. They're not spirits. But demons are something that's different, but it doesn't say where they come from. But there is one text that does say where they come from, and that's the book of Enoch. Wow. And so it is theoretical, but I kind of like the theory because it makes sense of the theology. And here's what it is. The book of Enoch says that when God destroyed the flood, and even afterwards, that when the Nephilim that were killed, because their spirits were, think about it, they're half angel, half human. So in the Bible, when a human dies, his spirit goes to Hades, the world of the dead, whether you're good or bad, and you await the judgment. But angels don't go to heaven or hell. I mean, they're either at God's throne or they're around the earth, the bad guys, right? But what if you're half angel, half human, and then you die? What happens? Well, your spirits aren't necessarily going to go to Hades, right? So the theory is that that's where evil spirits are. The evil spirits are the dead, the dead spirits of the Nephilim. But there's more to it than that. This is where it gets really cool for me. So that's, that might be where what demons are. But it also explains what's going on in the Gospels. When Jesus, like I said, when Jesus is going around, keep in mind, he claims to be the Messiah. And what did I say earlier? The whole Bible is about this war of the seed. What's the seed? The seed is the seed of the serpent versus the seed of Eve. And Jesus is the Messiah is ultimately the ultimate seed. By the way, seed means offspring, of course, but the ultimate seed who's going to win back salvation for his people and all this kind of stuff, right? So, but the seed of the serpent is rooted in this Nephilim stuff, which is, this violation of heaven and earth that's going on. But also it expands to include, idol worshipers, Canaanites, and all that kind of stuff. The godless, right? So by the time of Messiah, by the time of Jesus, the reason why he's casting out all these demons all of a sudden is because of this. Because he was coming back to claim that land. The land in the Old Testament, what did the Bible say? The Bible says that Israel was supposed to claim the land and live obediently, but it said that they didn't. It said that for hundreds of years at a time, Israelites would worship Baal and Asherah and all these demonic gods. and God would get ticked off, you know? And finally, when Messiah comes, there's been so much of this, you know, bad worship that it's like the land's infested with demons. It's like they get their power. It's like that war of the seed is still there, but now the leftover remnant are these demonic spirits. And when Messiah comes, he casts them out of the land. He cleanses the land because he's the King Messiah coming, you know, for his spiritual people and all this kind of stuff. So he's sort of like throwing them out. He's disinheriting them from the land, which was supposed to originally, you know, be for his people. So there's that tie-in that's going on, but that's not all that's going on. By the way, this is in Jesus Triumphant, which is the 8th novel in the series. I go into all this stuff, which is way more than, you know, the novel's not just Jesus walking around teaching all these teachings. That, to me, that gets boring. I got to have some action in there. So he goes around fighting all these demons and stuff. But there's one other element that I bring in there into the whole series, and it wraps up in Jesus Triumphant, that you guys will really find fascinating. Go back to that. Remember how I said the sons of God, Genesis? Well, there's another thing that happens in the Bible that's part of this weird seed storyline that I didn't see before. And it has to do with this. In Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 10, it says basically, God says, at the Tower of Babel, remember how mankind was trying to build a tower and be like God, and then God, it says that God, you know, confused the languages, and that's where and spread them out on the face of the earth. Well, it says in Deuteronomy 32 that when he did that, he basically said this. He goes, and he allotted them under the sons of God, but for Jacob, he allotted to himself. What that basically means in allotment and inheritance was this. He was saying, look, you guys continue to worship. You won't worship me. You keep worshiping false gods. I'm going to give you over, and you're going to be under the authority of those demonic gods that you're worshiping. But I'm going to keep Israel for myself, and I'm going to give them a territory. And all the nations have their territories. And in the ancient world, not just the Hebrews, but other ancient worldviews believed that behind the national powers, you know, earthly powers and kings, there was a spiritual authority behind them. There was a god or an angel. So the Bible also had this concept of different pagan nations had their pagan deities behind it, right? So when Christ comes, this is part of the message. It's like he's saying, I'm disinheriting all those gods, those nations, the people from those nations, and now I'm freeing them. They were enslaved all these years. I gave them over to be sort of under the authority of these demonic watchers, these demonic sons of God, right? And he says, I'm going to disinherit them. I'm going to take back my inheritance over all the earth so that all the nations then can come to me. And then that's why the Gospels talk about how, you know, men and tribes, you know, you read the book of Acts and all this stuff, and it's all about men of every tribe and nation can come to Messiah and have faith in him and all this stuff. It's because he's sort of winning back the authority of the earth. And that's what, spiritually, that's what Messiah was doing. So that's the sort of the big picture storyline that I'm telling that most people haven't really heard before. But I just found it so exciting. I had to tell the story. And so there you have it.
In the book of Enoch, I know probably more so than other places, but we're talking about long lifespans of people. Enoch, Methuselah, Noah. I mean, how do we get around that? Are we actually saying these guys were living hundreds of years, or?
Well, you know, there are different theories. One of which is in the ancient world before cataclysmic things like the flood, maybe everything was different, whether it's geometric pressure, atmosphere, and that may have allowed people to live longer ages. I'm open to that. Personally, though, I'm not. I consider that hyperliteralism, that interpretation when you say that all those ages were were literal. I don't personally believe they were. I think they're very symbolic. And in the ancient world, when they would want to write about men who were great men, they would say they lived these long years. Like the Sumerian king list does the same thing. And I don't think it's lying at all. That's how they wrote greatness. They wrote about greatness. You know, so-and-so lived 500 years, you know, because they're great, you know. And so that's how they describe their forefathers. So I'm of the interpretation that there's a lot of symbolism going on. And that's one of those elements of symbolism. So, yeah.
Sorry, just to add to that, sorry, Susan, and then I'll let you come in. Just to add to that, you know, in Irish mythology, in our Irish history, and our Irish Gaelic language today, we talk about our ancient, there's something like 70 semi-divine figures from the Fomorian giants, who are also known as the Ogs as well. So we have Angus Mac Og, which means Angus son of Og. There's the...
Really?
Yeah, and nobody talks about this stuff, Brian. And here's the thing. We have Ogma and Ogmaya. Even the place names of some of the megalithic structures have got Og in their name as well. A lot of the towns have Og in it, as they do in England too. Like Ogburn beside Avebury. But Og in Irish means to be forever young, or it means to be, you talk about the children of Og, or Tirnan Og is the land of the Og, the land of the Ogs, where people lived long periods of time. So it's bizarre that we have Ogs associated with giants, and we have Ogs that are also living long periods of time.
Yes. And like I said, I'm very open to the longer period. I mean, it wouldn't be a problem to me at all. Absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating possibilities. So yeah, I don't have a problem with it myself. But I do, like I said, there is a very famous, well-known tablet called the Sumerian King List, where it and it's probably one of the older documents, one of the oldest documents we have, because as you may know, the Sumerians are the oldest known first literary writers. About 3,000 years BC is the oldest writing that we have examples of, which is from Sumeria. Sure. And they write king lists of their kings, and they say so-and-so reigned 20,000 years, so-and-so reigned, those are ridiculous, but they're obviously symbolic, right? And so there might be some symbolism going on there as well. But nonetheless, yeah, I definitely see it as a possibility.
Wow.
The old ages. Sure.
Susan, you want to jump in? I think we've got one final question for Susan, I think.
You're cutting me off.
Well, no, it's top of the hour. It's only because it's
no, I know. Well, it's semi-related to the lion men of Moab. That possible hybridization. Here's where you've got information that is in these scriptures, and then you're making a possible tie-in here. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's one area that I'll admit I haven't. Most of my writing on that is more conjecture and kind of imagination. I haven't done extensive research as others have in terms of genetic hybridization and such, but I definitely, like I said, I see that possibility in Genesis 6. So maybe it continues on. And yeah, there's this strange passage in the story of David where it talks about how these lion men of Moab, and the word for that is Ariel, and they're not sure what the word means, but it's sort of like they have lion faces. And some people interpret that as being, that just means that a metaphor or a symbol for them being great warriors. But others indicate, no, not necessarily. So maybe there was some kind of genetic hybridization that was going on even into those time periods. I don't know, to me, it's more speculative, but those things do show up in the Bible. And so I wanted to play with them and sort of show that there's still the residualness in the text, even long after Genesis. And so I found a couple of those places where it did. It's interesting because many people would say, well, Chronicles of the Nephilim and giants, but you wrote a book on Jesus. There's no giants. Well, remember how I said the demons were spirits of the Nephilim? But more than that, I actually have done some ancient historical research. And the book, Josephus, who is a very famous ancient Jewish historian, he writes about a specific giant who's 10.5 feet tall. And he happened to be a captive. And it turns out, he writes about this guy, and it turns out he's right in the general location and general time period of the last years of Christ. So he was actually near that. So I bring him into my story in Jesus Triumphant. So there are these occasional monsters or giants that kind of show up throughout the text. And I definitely try to bring them in there and weave them in many different ways. I think that, there's more. Oh, there's another one you'll like, satyrs, right? Satyrs are those like Pan, the goat god, right? Where they're like men and then they have goat bottoms. Well, guess what? Satyrs show up in the Bible. Now, I'm one to say that I don't necessarily think that they're literal, but they show up in certain texts, and the text that they show up in is like Isaiah prophets who are prophesying about the destruction of different cities. And it talks about how, Babylon, you're going to be destroyed, and the satyrs will dance on your grave and with the goat demons. And so the ancient Jews sort of looked around Canaan, and Canaan worshipped Pan as well as many other deities, but they also believed in satyrs. So in some ways, the ancient Jews were using that imagery and sort of polemically against them and saying, yeah, well, I see your satyrs are demons to us, and they're going to dance on the graves of the destruction of Babylon. So I thought, well, what if we show some real satyrs show up, and as spiritual beings, of course. But so, yeah, I even have those show up in the text as well, along with flying fiery serpents and all kinds of cool things.
One of the, well, the oldest sources of the Book of Enoch in the UK, anyway, I know, was the Freemasons. They used to print their own copies of the Book of Enoch. Do you know why these guys would attach themselves to the Enoch story?
I don't know specifically, but just because I know the Book of Enoch, I know where they're drawn to, because Book of Enoch is actually consists of 5 books. And by the way, I've written a scholarly article on the Book of Enoch. It's for free. It's up on my website, so your listeners can go read it. But there's basically 5 books of Enoch, and they weren't all written at the same time period. But the first one is the Book of the Watchers, and that's the one we've been talking about. That's the most ancient one. That has the best tradition connected to it. But then later books were written by Gnostics and in the 400 AD, a little bit later sometimes. But those are ones where they bring in a lot of astrological things and, very heavily symbolic, magic-oriented language. I don't understand what all of it means, but I think that's probably what they're drawn to.
Sure. Brian, we're at the top of the hour. Please take a moment to give out the website for the book and your own personal website as well, I believe. Sure.
chroniclesofthenephilim.com. Everything's there. Tons of videos, free art, cool artwork, free articles, and all kinds of stuff. And Godawa.com is my personal website that has everything else on it too. But chroniclesofthenephilim.com has all the cool stuff that if you're interested in learning more about the series before you buy it. But if you just want to go, check out, buy one of them, they're really cheap on Kindle at Amazon. Everything's at Amazon. And I don't only have them on Kindle and paperback, but they're also in audiobooks. And people have been loving the audiobook versions because I put a lot of dramatic a little bit of acting into it. So people have been really enjoying those.
Wow. Susan, have you any final comments before we wrap things up?
I just want to say thank you so much. I look forward to diving in much deeper. And are you working on any independent films right now?
I am. I'm working on a horror film that actually, one of my horror films is about it's a reality TV show that debunks alien abductions and such. And they go up to a remote mountain cabin to debunk it, and they soon find out that they're dead wrong. So again, it's kind of related. It's related to all the stuff we're talking about. I think people if I ever get it made, it's just so hard. It's near impossible to get a movie made. I'm telling you, it's discouraging, but yeah, I'm working on it.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Brian.
Well, Brian, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, and you too, Susan. Godawa.com and chroniclesofthenephilim.com as well for today's author and researcher and very creative genius. So, Brian, absolute pleasure talking today. It's really enjoyed it. I'll talk to you in the not too distant future.
Thanks for having me, you guys.
Aloha.
Meaningful message, whether it's a documentary on church and state separation or stem cell research, or even the horror film I wrote, The Visitation, which is sort of like about demon possession, all that kind of stuff. I've been able to work on stuff that's more meaningful and have more of an impact, because the higher you go up in the food chain in Hollywood, the more you get involved in the bigger stuff, the less control you really have, and particularly as a writer. So I've kind of stayed in the independent realm for whatever reason. That's where I've been, and I'm grateful to have been there. But about five years ago or so, the whole industry was hit pretty hard, and it was really hard going for a couple of years of getting work. And it sort of forced me to reevaluate myself and reinvent myself. And I started thinking, well, what else can I do? Because not just screenwriting. And I'd always thought, someday in the future, I'll write novels when I don't make movies anymore. And for a year or so, I wasn't making any movies. And I thought, well, why don't I write a novel, But in that time period, excuse me, this is actually a transition, because in that time period, excuse me, I came up with this brilliant idea. I thought, okay, I got a great idea. I'm a religious believer. I believe in the Bible and that kind of stuff. And I love spiritual meaning and purpose and all that. So I thought, there was a story that, in recent years, people have been making some movies, from the Bible, or let's put it this way, certainly spiritually interested themes, whether it's, Greek gods, what was that series, the young adult series with Percy Jackson and Clash of the Titans. There's a real big religious interest in Hollywood movies, But I thought, well, I'll do something really unique that someone's never done before, because I started doing research on the story of Noah. And I discovered these amazing, bizarre things that I kind of knew were there, but I always avoided them. And of course, as you already know, I soon discovered, after I wrote my script, I was out trying to get it interested in Hollywood, and it was a big budget movie, and you really have to have good connections to get those things sold. So I wasn't doing that. Yeah, well, I started years ago, started out as solely a screenwriter, and that's all I wanted to really be in life. And I love movies. Anyway, my first movie that got made was To End All Wars, which starred Kiefer Sutherland and Robert Carlyle, and that came out around 2001 or 2002. And I got a lot of awards and a lot of critical acclaim. And that was a true story of prisoners of war, Allied prisoners of war under the Japanese during World War II. And it was kind of like, if you saw the movie Bridge on the River Kwai, this was the true story that you didn't see. It was the non-Hollywood version of the suffering that our servicemen really had to undergo during that time period. And it was a very, very powerful, moving spiritual story as well. And that kind of launched my film work, and since then I've been working as an independent filmmaker, which means I'm not like in the big studio system working on the big movies. Sure. I make the smaller movies, the lower budget movies, but the great thing that's been for me is I've been able to work on projects that I really believe in, that have a really
Brian, I just want to give a little bio on you before I bring you on. I think it's important for today. Brian Godawa has been a professional filmmaker, writer and visual artist for many years. Creative versatility born out of a passion for both intellect and imagination, left brain and right brain. The result is that Brian is an artisan of word, image and story that engages heart, mind and soul. Just think the Renaissance man. He has been a screenwriter for the award-winning feature film To End All Wars, which starred Kiefer Sutherland and alleged starring Brian Dennehy as Clarence Darrow, along with Fred Thompson as William Jennings Bryan. Previously, Brian adapted to film the best-selling supernatural thriller novel The Visitation by author Frank Peretti for Ralph Winter X-Men and Planet of the Apes. And if that wasn't enough, Brian is the author of the Chronicles of the Nephilim series of books, which is actually what we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, let's bring on our super exciting guest. Hi, Brian. You're very welcome to the show.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks for having me. Great
to have you, Brian. Brian, I had to do that. I know there's a lot to get through there on the bio. It's just a super interesting background you have. I guess to mention for the audience that the Chronicles of the Nephilim series is what we would call biblical fiction. It's an unusual genre, Brian. Before I get into that, and why you have gone down the biblical fiction route. Tell us about the screenwriting background. It's obviously incredibly interesting. I mean, you've got some heavy-hitting rapport there with some big names. Tell us a little bit about the screenplay writing element of your career first.